Your body can close a wound, but it cannot bring the skin back exactly as it was before. It can recover from strain, but the same movement never feels completely the same again. Healing happens, but something small is always left behind. Over time, those small differences begin to accumulate, quietly changing how the body feels without ever becoming obvious. In the natural world, many animals recover in ways that seem more complete, returning closer to what they were before the damage occurred. But the human body often moves forward instead, carrying its past within it. If the body can repair itself, why does it never fully return to what it was, and why can't humans repair themselves like other animals? The human body gives a strong impression of reliability when it comes to healing, because most forms of everyday damage seem to resolve on their own. A cut closes, a bruise fades, soreness reduces, and after some time the surface appears calm again, creating the sense that the body has returned to its original state. But when the same process is observed more carefully, a quieter pattern becomes visible, one that does not announce itself, but gradually becomes familiar, because the healed area is often not identical to what it was before. The skin may carry a faint difference in texture, a joint may move with slightly less ease, and a previously strained muscle may feel stable but not entirely unchanged, and these differences are not large enough to interrupt daily life, which is why they are often ignored. Yet they accumulate slowly over time and become part of the body's ongoing condition, not as isolated injuries but as a continuous record of past repair. And this distinction between healing and full restoration is a basic and widely accepted feature of human biology, because many tissues in the body are designed to repair damage efficiently rather than recreate the exact original structure. And this process often involves forming new tissue that is strong and functional, but organized in a simpler way, prioritizing closure and stability over perfect reconstruction. And this allows the body to continue functioning without delay, even if the repaired area is not identical to what existed before. And when this process repeats across many small events, the result is a body that continues to operate, but carries subtle variations in how it feels and responds. And this becomes easier to understand when placed within a broader biological context, because across different forms of life there are multiple strategies for dealing with damage. And while some organisms are capable of rebuilding structures with a high level of completeness, others rely on repair processes that are more conservative, focusing on maintaining integrity rather than restoring detail. And the human body follows this second pattern more consistently, not because it lacks the ability to repair, but because it operates under a different set of priorities. And these priorities become clearer when considered alongside the long arc of human existence, because early humans lived in environments where injury, strain, and unpredictability were common, and in such conditions the ability to stabilize quickly would have been more important than the ability to reconstruct perfectly. A wound that closes rapidly reduces immediate risk. A structure that regains basic function allows continued movement, and these outcomes increase the chances of survival in the short term. And survival, repeated over many generations, gradually shapes how biological systems behave, leading to repair processes that are reliable and efficient even if they are not exact. And this also changes how time is experienced within the body, because healing is not a single event that ends when visible signs disappear. It is part of a longer process in which the body integrates the past into its present form, and each repair leaves behind a small adjustment in structure, not as a failure, but as a record of what has been stabilized. And these adjustments influence how the body responds to future use, which is why an area that has been previously affected may feel different under repeated stress, not because it is still injured, but because it has been rebuilt in a way that reflects both its function and its history. And as this pattern continues over years, the body does not simply return to a baseline state after each event. Instead, it evolves gradually through a series of small, functional changes, and this creates a quiet shift in how repair is understood, because it is no longer a process of returning to what was, but a process of moving forward from what has occurred, carrying each adjustment into the next moment. And this does not suggest weakness or failure, but rather a system designed to prioritize continuity, allowing the body to remain stable and active across changing conditions, even if that means accepting small imperfections along the way. And when this is recognized, the experience of not feeling exactly the same after recovery becomes less surprising and more consistent with how the human body is structured to respond to damage, because the body heals in order to continue, not necessarily to recreate. And this difference, though subtle, becomes the foundation for a deeper question about why human repair takes this form and how it compares to other patterns of repair found in the natural world. When this pattern of healing is followed across more than one moment, it begins to feel less like a series of separate recoveries and more like a continuous process that never fully resets. Because each time the body repairs something, it does not return to an untouched state. It moves forward from where it currently stands, carrying small structural changes that are rarely noticeable on their own but become clearer when they accumulate. And this creates a quiet sense that the body is always adapting rather than restoring, always adjusting rather than returning. And this is not something that requires a major injury to observe, because even in ordinary daily life, the body experiences small forms of stress that require constant repair, such as pressure on joints, tension in muscles, and repeated movements that gradually alter how tissues are organized. And these changes are handled in the same way as more visible damage, through processes that aim to stabilize and maintain function rather than recreate every detail that was present before. And over time, this leads to a body that remains capable and responsive but is no longer identical to its earlier form. And this becomes especially noticeable when a familiar movement begins to feel slightly different, not painful or limited, but altered in a way that is difficult to define, as if the body has adjusted its internal structure in response to what it has experienced. And this adjustment reflects a deeper principle in human biology, where repair is closely linked to adaptation, meaning that the body does not simply fix damage, it incorporates the effects of that damage into its current design. And this approach becomes more understandable when viewed through the conditions in which early humans lived, because the environments that shaped the human body were not stable or predictable. They required constant response to changing terrain, temperature, and physical demands. And in such settings, the ability to adjust quickly would have been more valuable than the ability to restore perfectly, because waiting for complete reconstruction would delay movement and increase exposure to risk. Whereas a faster, function-oriented repair allows the individual to continue navigating the environment without interruption. And this pattern does not depend on conscious decision but is built into the biological systems that manage tissue repair, guiding them towards solutions that prioritize continuity. And this also influences how the body responds to repeated use, because areas that are used frequently are not simply maintained in their original form, they are reinforced and reshaped according to the demands placed on them, which is why the same activity can feel easier or more stable over time, even if the underlying structure has changed. And this process further blurs the distinction between healing and adaptation, because what appears to be recovery may also be a form of restructuring that reflects past conditions. And as this continues across longer periods, the body becomes a layered system where each stage of repair contributes to the next, creating a form that is both functional and historically shaped. And this does not imply that the body is deteriorating in a simple sense, but that it is evolving within its own lifespan, guided by the balance between immediate stability and long-term resilience. And this balance does not aim for perfection, it aims for sufficiency, ensuring that the body can continue to operate within the limits of its environment. And when this is recognized, the idea of repair begins to shift, because it is no longer about returning to a previous state, but about maintaining the ability to move forward despite accumulated change. And this perspective makes it easier to understand why certain differences remain after recovery, and why those differences do not necessarily interfere with function, because they are part of how the body maintains continuity over time. And this raises a deeper question that connects back to the broader comparison with other forms of life, because if the human body is designed to repair through adaptation and continuation, then what determines how far that process can go? And why does it seem to stop short of full restoration in ways that feel different from what we might observe elsewhere in the natural world? As this pattern continues across longer stretches of time, it begins to shape not only how the body repairs itself, but how the body understands what normal feels like. Because each cycle of damage and repair does not simply resolve and disappear, it leaves behind a slightly adjusted version of stability, and that adjusted version becomes the new reference point from which the next change is measured. And this shift is subtle enough that it rarely draws attention, because the body does not announce that it has changed. It simply continues to function, and in doing so, it gradually redefines its own baseline without ever returning to an earlier state. And this is why the experience of the body can feel continuous, even when its structure is quietly evolving, because there is no clear moment when one version ends and another begins, only a smooth transition shaped by accumulated repair. And this process is consistent with widely accepted principles in human physiology, where tissues are constantly renewed, remodeled, and reorganized in response to use, stress, and prior damage. And these processes do not aim to recreate an original template stored somewhere unchanged. Instead, they operate based on the current condition of the tissue, using what is already present as the starting point for the next stage of repair. And this means that every act of healing builds upon what remains rather than what once existed, reinforcing the idea that the body moves forward through continuity rather than returning through restoration. And when this is placed within the context of human origins, the pattern becomes more grounded, because early human environments required ongoing adjustment rather than perfect recovery. Movement across uneven terrain, exposure to shifting climates, and repeated physical effort would have placed continuous demands on the body, and under such conditions a system that could adapt quickly and maintain function would have been more effective than one that required complete reconstruction after each disruption. And this does not suggest that humans were constantly injured or impaired, but that the biological systems governing repair were shaped to favor resilience and continuity over precision. And this shaping is still visible in how the body responds today, where repair processes are tightly regulated to ensure that they do not introduce instability, even if that means accepting a less exact outcome. And this regulation is important because rapid or uncontrolled reconstruction can create errors, and in complex organisms like humans, maintaining structural and functional consistency is critical for long-term survival. So the body balances the need to repair with the need to preserve overall organization, and this balance influences not only how tissues heal, but how they age, because over time the accumulation of small, imperfect repairs contributes to gradual changes in how the body feels and performs. And these changes are often interpreted as decline, but they can also be understood as the result of a system that has prioritized stability across many years rather than perfection in each moment. And this perspective shifts the way repair is understood, from a process that restores what was lost to a process that ensures what remains can continue. And this shift becomes especially clear when comparing the expectation of full restoration with the reality of how the body actually behaves, because the expectation assumes that the body should be able to return to an original state, while the reality shows that the body is designed to carry its history forward, integrating each experience into its present structure. And this integration is not a failure of repair, it is a defining feature of how human biology manages change over time. And as this becomes more apparent, the initial assumption that healing should mean complete restoration begins to feel less certain, because the body is not organized around reversing what has happened, it is organized around continuing despite it. And this leads to a deeper and more focused question that remains unresolved at this stage. If the human body consistently repairs through continuity and adaptation, rather than full reconstruction, then what limits its ability to restore completely? And why does this limitation become more noticeable when humans are compared to other forms of life that appear to recover in different ways? When the human pattern of repair is placed beside what is observed in other animals, the difference does not appear as a dramatic contrast at first, but as a gradual shift in how recovery unfolds. Because many animals also experience injury, strain, and wear, yet in some cases their return to function seems more complete, not only in outward appearance but in how the structure behaves afterward. And this observation has been studied in basic biology through the concept of regeneration, where certain species are able to rebuild parts of their bodies in a way that restores both form and function more closely to the original. And while this ability is not universal across all animals, it is well documented in specific groups, such as some amphibians that can regenerate limbs or certain reptiles that can regrow parts of their tails. And these processes involve rebuilding tissue in a way that resembles the original organization, rather than simply closing the wound, and this creates a form of repair that feels different from the human experience, where restoration is often partial and leaves behind subtle traces of change. And it is important to approach this comparison carefully, because not all animals regenerate in this way, and even among those that do, The process has limits and trade-offs, but the existence of these differences raises a meaningful question about why human repair follows a different pattern, and the answer does not lie in a single missing ability, but in a broader set of biological priorities that shape how repair is carried out. And in humans, the repair process is strongly guided by systems that aim to control growth, prevent instability, and maintain overall organization, and these systems are highly active and tightly regulated, ensuring that cells divide and rebuild tissue in a controlled manner, which reduces the risk of uncontrolled growth or structural disruption. And this control is a widely recognized feature of complex organisms, where maintaining stability across many interconnected systems becomes essential. And this contrasts with some forms of regeneration in other species, where the body can reinitiate developmental pathways that allow structures to be rebuilt more completely, often involving patterns of growth that resemble earlier stages of development. And while these processes are effective within those organisms, they are not directly transferable to humans because the underlying biological context is different. And this difference becomes clearer when considering the scale and complexity of the human body, which includes highly specialized tissues and long-lived cells that must remain coordinated over extended periods of time. And in such a system, rapid or extensive reconstruction carries greater risk, because even small errors can disrupt function in ways that are difficult to correct. And this risk influences how repair is managed, leading to solutions that prioritize consistency and control over completeness. And when this is placed within the context of human origins, the pattern becomes more grounded, because early human survival depended not only on immediate recovery, but on maintaining stable function across many years, navigating varied environments, and supporting complex behaviors that required coordination between different systems in the body. And in this setting, a repair strategy that minimizes risk and preserves overall structure would have been advantageous, even if it results in less complete restoration at the level of individual tissues. And this perspective helps explain why human repair feels different, not because it is absent or ineffective, but because it operates within constraints that reflect the needs of a long-lived, highly integrated organism. And this creates a subtle but consistent contrast with certain other animals, where the balance between regeneration and control is set differently, allowing for more complete rebuilding in specific contexts. And as this comparison becomes clearer, the initial assumption that all forms of repair should lead to full restoration begins to shift, because the human body is not following the same priorities, and this raises a more focused question that guides the next stage of understanding. If humans possess the ability to repair but regulate it in ways that limit full reconstruction, then what determines how much repair is allowed to occur, and how does the body decide when to restore and when to simply stabilize what remains? The more closely this comparison is examined, the more important it becomes to avoid a simple misunderstanding, because the difference between humans and other animals is not that animals repair everything perfectly while humans do not, and it is also not that humans are biologically weak. Instead, the more accurate picture is that living organisms solve the problem of damage in different ways, depending on how their bodies are built, how long they usually live, how quickly they grow, and what kinds of risk their tissues can tolerate. And this wider view matters because once a few well-known examples of regeneration are mentioned, it becomes easy to imagine that nature has a complete repair system available everywhere, and that humans somehow lost access to it. But widely accepted biology does not support that simple idea, because many animals also heal with scarring. Many forms of regeneration are limited to particular tissues or life stages, and even in animals famous for regeneration, the process is shaped by strict biological conditions. So the real contrast is not between total failure and total restoration, but between different balances of speed, control, regrowth, and risk. And that balance becomes especially important when the body contains highly specialized tissues that must remain stable for a long time, as in humans, where repair is not only about closing damage, but also about preserving the coordinated function of the whole organism. And this helps explain why human healing often appears cautious, because the body is not merely rebuilding a local area, it is trying to preserve order across an integrated system, in which muscles, nerves, blood vessels, connective tissue, and immune responses all need to remain compatible with one another. And once this is understood, the human pattern begins to look less like a missing ability and more like a regulated compromise, because a system that allows broad and rapid rebuilding may also increase the chance of misdirected growth, structural error, or loss of tissue identity, while a system that restricts growth more tightly may produce slower but more stable repair. And this trade-off is deeply familiar in biology, where advantages are rarely free and one capacity is often strengthened at the cost of another. And when this broader principle is placed against the long background of human origins, the logic becomes clearer, because the human body emerged within a lineage shaped not only by survival from one injury to the next, but by the demands of extended development, long childhood, complex social dependence, large brains, and relatively long adult life. And all of these features increase the importance of maintaining reliable organization over time, since the body is not built for quick growth followed by short existence, but for sustained coordination across many years, and in such a body, repair must be compatible with long-term stability, not only with short-term recovery, and this helps explain why certain animals can redirect biological programs toward rebuilding in ways that appear more dramatic, while humans more often direct their resources towards sealing, supporting, and preserving function, and this difference can even be felt in ordinary human experience, because recovery often means that something becomes usable again without becoming completely identical to what it was before, and that experience reflects a larger biological strategy rather than a local accident. And it also shows why the comparison with other animals must be made carefully, because what appears to be superior repair in another species may belong to a body with very different constraints, different developmental timing, different metabolic priorities, and different consequences for error. So the question is not why humans failed to copy a better design, but why human biology came to rely on a different kind of repair altogether. And once that question is taken seriously, the comparison begins to deepen, because it shifts attention away from visible outcomes alone and toward the internal rules governing what kind of healing the body allows, what kind of tissue it chooses to rebuild, and where it draws a boundary between restoration and control. And that boundary matters because it reveals that the human body is not simply unable to regenerate in the ways some other animals can, but is instead shaped by a system that limits how far repair is permitted to go. And if that limit is real, then the next question becomes unavoidable. What is the body protecting when it restrains repair? And why would a species that depends so heavily on endurance, mobility, and long life evolve a healing strategy that so often settles for continuity instead of full return? When this comparison is followed to its deeper level, the question begins to shift from what is visible on the surface to what is happening within the rules that guide repair itself. Because the human body does not simply fail to regenerate in the same way as some other animals, it actively regulates how repair unfolds, and this regulation is rooted in widely accepted biological principles that govern how cells divide, specialize, and organize into stable tissues. And one of the most consistent features of human biology is that cell growth is tightly controlled, meaning that when damage occurs, the body does not allow unrestricted rebuilding, but instead activates processes that limit how much and how quickly cells can grow. And this control is essential for maintaining order in complex tissues, where different cell types must remain in precise arrangements for the body to function properly. And if this arrangement is disrupted, even by well-intentioned repair, the result can be instability rather than improvement. And this helps explain why human repair often favors closing damage and reinforcing structure rather than recreating the exact original form, because recreating that form would require reactivating developmental pathways that are largely reduced or restricted after early stages of life. And this pattern is well documented in developmental biology, where many organisms show greater regenerative capacity during early growth phases and more limited repair strategies later on. And in humans, this shift toward controlled repair is particularly strong, reflecting the need to preserve long-term stability across a highly specialized body. And this becomes more meaningful when placed within the context of human origins, because early human survival depended on maintaining coordinated function over extended periods rather than rapidly rebuilding complex structures from scratch. And in such conditions, a repair system that reduces the risk of structural error would support continued movement, tool use, and social interaction, all of which require consistent and predictable physical function. And this consistency becomes especially important when considering the role of the nervous system, where precise connections are necessary for coordinated action, and uncontrolled or excessive regrowth in such systems could lead to dysfunction rather than recovery. So the body applies strict limits to how repair proceeds, ensuring that new tissue integrates safely with what already exists. And this approach is not unique to one part of the body, but reflects a general strategy across multiple systems, where repair is guided by constraints that protect overall organization, and these constraints are not signs of weakness but of regulation, because they allow the body to maintain coherence over time, even if that means accepting a less complete restoration in specific areas. And this perspective also clarifies why comparisons with other animals must be made carefully, because organisms that exhibit more extensive regeneration often operate under different biological conditions, including different patterns of growth, shorter life cycles, or less complex tissue organization, and these conditions allow for forms of repair that would not necessarily produce stable outcomes in the human body. So the difference is not simply one of ability, but of context, where each species balances repair, growth, and control according to its own structure and lifespan. And when this balance is viewed as part of a broader evolutionary pattern, the human approach to repair begins to appear more consistent, because it reflects a system designed to manage long-term stability rather than short-term completeness. And this does not eliminate the possibility of repair, but it shapes how far that repair is allowed to go, setting boundaries that prioritize integration over reconstruction. And as this becomes clearer, the original comparison begins to take on a more precise meaning, because it is no longer about why humans cannot repair themselves in the same way as other animals, but about how the human body defines repair differently, and why that definition leads to outcomes that feel incomplete when measured against expectations of full restoration. And this leads directly to the next question. If human repair is intentionally limited by systems that protect stability, then what specific trade-offs does the body make in order to maintain that balance? And how do those trade-offs shape the way repair unfolds over time? When the focus shifts from comparison to internal design, the pace of human repair begins to make more sense, because it is not simply that the body heals more slowly, but that the entire process is organized around careful progression rather than rapid reconstruction. And this pattern is widely recognized in human physiology, where repair unfolds through multiple coordinated stages that must occur in sequence, including inflammation, tissue formation, and remodeling, each one regulated by signals that ensure the process remains controlled and does not move beyond what the body can safely manage. And this sequence introduces time as a necessary element of repair, not as a delay or inefficiency, but as part of how the system maintains order, because each stage prepares the conditions for the next, allowing the body to stabilize the damaged area before attempting to rebuild it. And this is especially important in a body where many tissues are interconnected and depend on each other for proper function, because a repair that moves too quickly or skips necessary steps can lead to mismatched structures or incomplete integration. And this risk becomes more significant in a complex organism like a human, where muscles, connective tissue, blood supply, and nerve pathways must align correctly for movement and sensation to remain consistent. And as a result, the body favors a slower and more controlled repair process that reduces the chance of disruption, even if it means that recovery takes longer and does not fully restore the original structure. And this approach reflects a broader principle in biology, where stability is often prioritized over speed, especially in organisms that depend on long-term function rather than rapid growth. And this principle becomes clearer when considered in the context of human origins, because early human life required sustained physical capability across many years, not just brief periods of rapid recovery. And in such conditions, a system that protects structural integrity over time would support survival more effectively than one that focuses on immediate reconstruction without regard for long-term consequences. And this is not to suggest that early humans experienced repair in a fundamentally different way, but that the biological systems guiding repair were shaped under pressures that favored consistency and reliability, and those same systems remain active in the body today, influencing how injuries resolve and how tissues reorganize after stress. And this also helps explain why the experience of healing often feels gradual and incomplete, because the body is not designed to return to an exact previous state, but to establish a stable configuration that can support ongoing function. and this configuration is influenced by what has already occurred, meaning that each repair builds upon the current condition of the tissue rather than an original template, and this further reinforces the idea that human repair is a forward-moving process, shaped by accumulated experience rather than reset by each event. And this forward movement introduces another important element, which is that repair must remain compatible with the rest of the body as it changes over time, because the conditions present during one stage of life are not identical to those in another, and the body must adjust its repair strategies accordingly, maintaining coherence across different phases rather than attempting to recreate a fixed original form. And this adaptability supports long-term function, but it also contributes to the sense that repair never fully restores what was lost, because the context in which repair occurs is always shifting, and as this becomes more apparent, the slower pace of human healing begins to feel less like a limitation and more like a reflection of the body's priorities, where each step is guided by the need to maintain integration, reduce risk, and support continuity, even if that means accepting outcomes that are stable rather than exact. And this raises a more focused question that moves beyond comparison and into mechanism. If the human body is designed to repair slowly and carefully in order to protect long-term function, then what specific trade-offs are being made within that process? And how do those trade-offs shape the balance between what is restored and what is carried forward? When the process of repair is examined more closely, the presence of trade-offs becomes more visible, because the body is not simply choosing between healing and not healing, it is constantly balancing multiple demands at the same time. And this balance is shaped by widely accepted principles in physiology where energy, time, and biological resources are limited and must be distributed across different functions. And among those functions, repair is only one part of a larger system that also includes maintaining basic metabolism, supporting the immune response, preserving brain function, and in certain stages of life, sustaining reproduction and development. And this means that repair cannot operate without limits, because it must remain compatible with everything else the body is doing. And this introduces a constraint that influences how much repair can occur and how quickly it can proceed. And in humans, this constraint is particularly important because the body is not designed for short-term cycles of damage and rapid rebuilding, but for extended periods of coordinated function where stability across systems is essential. And this becomes clearer when considering that the human brain consumes a significant portion of the body's energy, and its function depends on a stable internal environment. So repair processes must avoid creating disruptions that could interfere with that stability, and this further reinforces the need for controlled, stepwise healing rather than rapid reconstruction. And in addition to energy distribution, there is also the question of cellular control, because repair involves cell division and tissue growth, and these processes must be tightly regulated to prevent errors, and this regulation is widely recognized as a key aspect of maintaining tissue integrity, since uncontrolled growth can lead to disorganized structures that do not function properly, and in extreme cases may create harmful conditions. So the body limits how aggressively it allows tissues to regenerate, favoring repair strategies that maintain order even if they do not fully recreate the original form. And this is another example of a trade-off, where reducing risk takes priority over achieving completeness. And this trade-off becomes more meaningful when viewed in the context of human origins, because early humans depended on maintaining functional capacity over long periods, often in environments where sustained mobility, tool use, and social coordination were critical, and under such conditions, a repair system that protects against instability would support survival more reliably than one that attempts rapid and extensive rebuilding with a higher chance of error. And this perspective helps explain why human repair often results in tissues that are strong and functional, but structurally simplified, because such tissues are easier to produce, easier to integrate, and less likely to disrupt surrounding systems. And over time, these outcomes contribute to a body that continues to operate effectively, but carries subtle signs of previous repair. And these signs are not indicators of failure, but of how the body manages its internal priorities, distributing resources in a way that supports continuity rather than perfection. And this distribution also affects how the body responds to repeated stress, because once a tissue has been repaired, it may be reinforced in a way that reflects its recent use, making it more suited to similar demands in the future but less identical to its original state. And this reinforces the idea that repair is closely linked to adaptation, where the body integrates past conditions into its present structure. And as this pattern continues, it becomes clear that human repair is shaped by a network of constraints that guide how far restoration can go, ensuring that the outcome remains compatible with the overall system. And this leads to a deeper question about the nature of these constraints. Because if repair is limited by the need to balance energy, control growth, and maintain stability, then how does the body determine where to draw the line between restoring what was lost and preserving what already exists? And what does that decision reveal about the deeper logic of how the human body is designed to endure over time? As these constraints come together, the boundary of human repair begins to take a clearer form, not as a fixed limit imposed from outside, but as an outcome of how the body maintains balance within itself, because every act of healing must pass through systems that regulate growth, coordinate structure, and preserve overall stability. And these systems do not operate independently. They interact continuously, shaping how far repair is allowed to proceed and when it must stop. And this creates a threshold that is rarely visible but consistently present, where the body shifts from rebuilding towards stabilizing. And this shift is not abrupt. It emerges gradually as the repaired tissue reaches a point where further reconstruction would require greater risk or greater disruption to the surrounding system. And at that point, the body accepts a structure that is sufficient rather than exact. And this acceptance is not passive. It is an active outcome of regulation, guided by signals that limit cell proliferation, adjust tissue remodeling, and ensure that new structures integrate with what already exists. And these regulatory processes are well established in human biology, particularly in how tissues transition from early stages of repair into longer-term organization, where the emphasis moves away from rapid change and toward maintaining integrity. And this transition is one of the reasons why human healing often results in stable but simplified structures, because the body is prioritizing compatibility over precision. And this priority becomes more understandable when considered within the broader context of human existence, because early humans relied on bodies that could remain functional across long periods, adapting to repeated use and varied environments without losing coherence. And in such conditions, a repair system that occasionally sacrifices detail in order to preserve function would have supported survival more reliably than one that attempts full reconstruction at the cost of increased instability. And this perspective also helps explain why the human body tends to retain traces of past repair, because those traces are part of how the system maintains continuity. They represent points where the body chose stability over restoration. And once that choice is made, it becomes part of the structure that future repair must build upon, reinforcing the idea that healing is a forward-moving process rather than a return to a previous state. And this forward movement introduces a cumulative effect, where each repair slightly adjusts the conditions for the next, creating a layered system that reflects both function and history. And over time, this layering contributes to the experience of gradual change, not as a sudden decline, but as the result of many small decisions made by the body to preserve itself within safe limits. And these limits are not arbitrary. They are shaped by the need to avoid errors in complex tissues, to maintain coordination between systems, and to ensure that the body remains usable across different stages of life. And when viewed in this way, the apparent incompleteness of human repair becomes more consistent with its purpose, because the goal is not to recreate what was lost, but to ensure that what remains can continue to operate without disruption. And this understanding shifts the meaning of repair from an attempt at perfection to a process of controlled continuity, where each outcome reflects a balance between what is possible and what is safe. And this balance, once recognized, raises a more focused question that leads into the next stage of exploration. If the body consistently stops repair at the point where stability is secured, then what determines how much imperfection can be carried forward without interfering with function? And how does this accumulation shape the long-term experience of living in a human body over time? When the effects of these limits are extended across many years, the relationship between repair and time begins to change in a way that is central to understanding the human body, because the body is not only repairing damage in the present, it is also carrying the consequences of past repair into the future. and this accumulation becomes more significant in a species with a relatively long lifespan, where tissues are used, repaired, and used again over extended periods. And in widely accepted biology, this pattern is closely connected to how aging is understood, not as a single event, but as a gradual outcome of many small changes that build over time. And among those changes are the results of repair processes that prioritize function and stability rather than complete restoration. And this means that each repair contributes not only to immediate recovery, but also to the long-term condition of the body, because the repaired tissue becomes part of what will be repaired again in the future, and this creates a layered structure in which past adjustments influence present responses. And this layering is not unique to one part of the body. It occurs across multiple systems, including connective tissues, muscle, and even at the level of cells where maintenance processes must balance accuracy with efficiency. And this balance becomes increasingly important as time passes, because the longer the body exists, the more opportunities there are for small imperfections to accumulate. And these imperfections are not necessarily harmful in isolation, but together they begin to shape how the body feels and functions. And this shaping is often experienced as a gradual change rather than a sudden loss, because each individual repair remains within the limits of normal function, and it is only through accumulation that the overall effect becomes noticeable. And this pattern can be understood more clearly when considered in the context of human origins, because early humans did not rely on perfect restoration after each challenge, but on the ability to continue functioning across many cycles of use and repair, and in such conditions, a system that allows small imperfections to persist would still support survival, as long as overall function remained intact. And this suggests that the human body is not designed to maintain an unchanged state indefinitely, but to manage change in a way that allows continuity over time. And this management involves accepting certain forms of incomplete repair as part of the process, because eliminating every imperfection would require levels of energy, time, and biological control that are not compatible with the body's broader priorities. And this is consistent with widely accepted evolutionary principles, where traits that support survival and reproduction are favored, even if they do not produce perfect outcomes in every aspect of function. And this helps explain why the human body does not eliminate all traces of damage, but instead integrates them into its structure, maintaining a balance between repair and persistence. And as this balance continues across years, it becomes part of the experience of aging, where the body remains capable but reflects the cumulative effects of its history. And this does not mean that repair becomes ineffective, but that its role shifts, because instead of returning the body to an original condition, it works to preserve function within a gradually changing system. And this shift can be felt in the way recovery takes longer. Differences remain more noticeable, and the sense of returning to a previous state becomes less complete. And these changes are not separate from the repair process, they are the result of how that process operates over time. And when this is recognized, the idea that the body cannot fully restore itself becomes less surprising, because it reflects a system that is designed to endure rather than to reset. And this raises a deeper question about the nature of that endurance. If the human body accepts the accumulation of imperfect repairs as part of its long-term function, then how does it determine what level of imperfection can be tolerated? And at what point does the balance between repair and accumulation begin to shift in ways that become more noticeable in everyday experience? As this accumulation continues, the body begins to rely more heavily on maintenance rather than full repair, and this shift is a well-established concept in biology, where systems that persist over long periods gradually move from rebuilding toward preserving what already exists. And in humans, this transition is especially important because many tissues are expected to function across decades, not just short cycles of growth and replacement, and this creates a situation where repair must be balanced with ongoing maintenance processes that stabilize cells, regulate internal conditions, and prevent the breakdown of essential structures. And these processes include mechanisms that monitor cellular damage, remove components that are no longer functioning properly, and reinforce tissues so that they can continue to operate under repeated stress. And while these systems are effective at maintaining function, they do not always restore the original state of the tissue. Instead, they preserve a workable condition that allows the body to continue. And this difference becomes more visible over time because maintenance does not erase the past. It manages its consequences, And this management is shaped by the same constraints that influence repair, including limited energy, the need for control over cell growth, and the requirement that all parts of the body remain coordinated. And when these constraints are considered together, it becomes clear that the body is not designed to eliminate every trace of damage, but to contain and integrate it in a way that does not disrupt overall function. And this approach reflects a broader principle in human biology, where long-term stability is prioritized over short-term perfection. And this principle can be traced back to the conditions under which the human body evolved, because early humans depended on maintaining consistent physical and cognitive function across extended periods, often in environments where continuous adaptation was necessary. And in such conditions, a system that focuses on preserving function rather than restoring exact structure would support survival more effectively, since it reduces the risk of instability and allows the body to remain usable even when conditions are not ideal. And this perspective helps explain why certain forms of damage are not fully reversed, because doing so would require processes that could interfere with the balance of the system, and instead the body redirects its resources toward maintaining what is already in place, reinforcing it, adjusting it, and ensuring that it remains compatible with the rest of the organism. And this redirection does not mean that repair has stopped, but that its role has changed, becoming part of a larger network of processes that aim to sustain function over time. And this network operates continuously, even when there is no visible injury, because the body is always managing small forms of wear and adjusting its internal structures accordingly. And over years, this ongoing management shapes how the body feels, creating a sense that recovery is no longer about returning to a previous state, but about maintaining a stable condition within changing limits. And this shift can be experienced in subtle ways, such as when recovery takes longer or when the body feels less responsive to the same forms of rest and repair. And these experiences are consistent with the idea that the body is operating under a different balance between repair and maintenance, one that reflects the demands of long-term function rather than immediate restoration. And this balance raises an important question that guides the next stage of understanding. If the body increasingly relies on maintenance to preserve function as time passes, then how does it decide which structures to maintain, which to adjust, and which to leave partially repaired? And what does that decision reveal about the deeper priorities that shape how the human body endures across its lifespan? As this balance between repair and maintenance continues to shift, the body begins to reveal a deeper pattern in how it manages imperfection, because not all changes are treated equally, and the body does not attempt to correct every difference that remains after repair. Instead, it evaluates, through its internal regulatory systems, whether a structure is still functional enough to be maintained. And this evaluation is not conscious, but emerges from widely accepted biological processes that monitor tissue performance, cellular stress, and the integrity of essential systems. And when a structure continues to meet the minimum requirements for function, even if it is not identical to its original form, the body often preserves it rather than replacing it. And this preservation reduces the need for additional energy and avoids the risks associated with further reconstruction. And this approach becomes more consistent as time progresses, because the cost of rebuilding complex tissues increases relative to the benefit of restoring them perfectly, especially in a system that must remain stable across many years. And this is why certain imperfections persist without being fully corrected, not because the body is unaware of them, but because correcting them would not significantly improve overall function within the constraints of the system. And this pattern is supported by widely accepted principles in aging biology, where maintenance and repair processes operate within limits that are shaped by resource availability, cellular control, and the need to prevent instability. And these limits influence how the body responds to accumulated change, guiding it towards solutions that preserve usability rather than eliminate every trace of past damage. And this perspective becomes more grounded when considered alongside human origins, because early humans depended on maintaining a level of function that allowed continued movement, interaction, and adaptation to changing environments. And in such conditions, a body that could remain operational despite imperfections would support survival more reliably than one that required complete restoration before functioning again. And this does not suggest that the body accepts all forms of damage equally, because there are systems in place that actively repair or remove structures that threaten overall stability, but it does suggest that there is a threshold below which imperfections are tolerated, integrated, and carried forward. And this threshold is not fixed. It changes with context, influenced by factors such as age, current condition, and the demands placed on the body. And as this threshold shifts, the experience of repair also changes, because what was once fully restored may later be only partially resolved, and what was once unnoticed may gradually become more apparent. And these changes reflect the body's ongoing adjustment to the balance between maintaining stability and managing accumulated difference. And over time, this creates a sense that the body is not returning to a previous state, but moving within a range of acceptable variation, where function is preserved even as structure evolves. And this understanding helps explain why human repair often feels incomplete. Because the body is not aiming to recreate an exact original form, it is aiming to maintain a system that can continue to operate within safe limits. And these limits define how much imperfection can be carried forward without disrupting function. And as this becomes clearer, the original question about why humans cannot repair themselves like other animals begins to take on a more precise meaning. Because the issue is not simply about the ability to repair, but about how the body determines what is necessary to repair and what can remain as it is. And this leads directly to the next stage of exploration. If human repair allows certain imperfections to persist as part of maintaining stability, then how do these accumulated changes influence the way tissues are rebuilt over time? And why do some forms of repair result in structures that are clearly different from what existed before? When the outcome of human repair is observed at the level of tissue, one of the most consistent patterns that appears is the formation of structures that are functional but not identical to what was there before. And this pattern is especially clear in the way many injuries heal through the creation of scar tissue, a process that is widely recognized in human biology as part of normal wound healing. And scar tissue does not represent a failure of repair, but a specific type of repair in which the body prioritizes closing and strengthening the damaged area rather than recreating its original complexity. And this difference can be understood by looking at how tissues are organized, because many parts of the body are composed of highly ordered structures where cells are arranged in precise patterns that support specialized functions. And when damage disrupts this organization, rebuilding it exactly would require re-establishing those patterns in detail, which is a complex and tightly controlled process. And instead, the body often replaces the damaged area with a simpler form of connective tissue that can be produced more quickly and integrated more reliably. And this connective tissue, commonly referred to as scar tissue, is typically strong and stable, allowing the body to maintain structural integrity even if the original arrangement is not fully restored. And this reflects a widely accepted trade-off in human physiology, where strength and speed of repair are prioritized over exact reconstruction. And this trade-off becomes more understandable when considered in the context of human origins, because early humans needed to maintain physical function in environments where injury could not be allowed to remain open or unstable for long periods. And in such conditions, a repair system that could quickly reinforce damaged areas would reduce immediate risk and allow continued movement, which would be critical for survival. And this same system remains active in the body today, guiding how tissues respond to damage by forming structures that are sufficient for function, even if they differ from the original design. And this difference is not always visible, but it can be felt in the way a healed area behaves, where the surface may appear normal but the underlying structure responds differently to stress or movement, and this reflects the fact that scar tissue does not always replicate the original alignment of fibers or the same level of flexibility, and as a result, the repaired area may be less adaptable to certain forms of strain, even though it remains stable under normal conditions. And this contributes to the broader experience of healing as a process that restores usability without fully recreating what was lost. And this pattern is not limited to visible injuries, because similar principles apply in other tissues where repair involves rebuilding in a simplified or altered form, and over time, these changes contribute to the overall condition of the body, creating a structure that is shaped not only by its original development, but by the cumulative effects of past repair. And this cumulative effect reinforces the idea that human healing is oriented toward continuity rather than exact restoration. And it also highlights why the comparison with other animals often focuses on regeneration, because regeneration involves rebuilding tissue in a way that more closely matches the original structure, whereas human repair more often results in functional replacement. And this difference is not absolute, but it is consistent enough to shape how healing is experienced. And it leads to a more focused question about the nature of this outcome. If the human body regularly replaces damaged tissue with structures that are simpler and more stable rather than identical, then what determines when this kind of repair is used instead of more complete reconstruction? And why does this approach remain the dominant strategy in human biology across so many different forms of injury and stress? When the formation of scar tissue is examined more closely, it becomes clear that this outcome is not random, but guided by a set of biological decisions that favor reliability and integration over exact reconstruction. And these decisions are shaped by how the body manages the environment at the site of injury. Because once damage occurs, the priority is to stabilize the area, control potential infection, and rebuild enough structure to restore basic function. And this sequence unfolds through well-established stages of wound healing, where the body first secures the damaged region, then begins to rebuild tissue using available cells and structural components, and finally reorganizes that tissue to improve strength and usability. And throughout this process, the body operates within constraints that limit how much it can recreate the original complexity, because rebuilding a highly organized structure would require precise signaling and coordination that may not be possible under the conditions present during repair, and instead the body uses a more accessible strategy, producing connective tissue that can be laid down efficiently and aligned in a way that supports stability. And this connective tissue, while strong, does not fully replicate the original arrangement of fibers or the specialized features of the tissue that was lost. And this is why the repaired area may behave differently under certain conditions, even though it appears healed. And this difference reflects a widely accepted principle in human physiology, where the goal of repair is to restore function quickly enough to maintain overall integrity, rather than to recreate the original structure in full detail. And this principle becomes more understandable when considered in the context of human origins, because early humans faced environments where delays in recovery could increase exposure to risk. And in such conditions, a repair system that emphasizes speed and stability would allow individuals to resume movement and interaction sooner, even if the repaired tissue is not identical to what it replaced. And this strategy would support survival by reducing the time during which the body is vulnerable. And this same logic continues to influence how the body responds today, where repair processes are optimized for producing reliable outcomes under a wide range of conditions. And this optimization includes limiting the complexity of reconstruction in order to reduce the chance of error, because attempting to rebuild a highly specialized structure without perfect control could result in misalignment or instability, which would compromise function more than a simplified but stable repair. And this trade-off is consistent with broader biological patterns, where systems prioritize outcomes that are robust and repeatable over those that are exact but more difficult to achieve. And this helps explain why scar tissue is such a common result of healing, because it represents a solution that can be applied consistently across different types of damage, providing strength and continuity even when precise reconstruction is not feasible. And over time, the accumulation of these repairs contributes to the overall structure of the body, creating tissues that reflect both their original design and the history of how they have been repaired. And this layered structure reinforces the idea that human healing is not about returning to an untouched state, but about maintaining function through a series of adjustments that are shaped by both immediate needs and long-term constraints. And as this becomes clearer, the question of why the body uses this strategy instead of more complete regeneration becomes more focused, because it is no longer about whether the body can rebuild, but about why it consistently chooses a form of rebuilding that favors stability over exactness. And this leads to a deeper inquiry into the conditions under which more complete reconstruction might occur, and what factors prevent that from becoming the dominant pattern in human repair. When this pattern of repair is followed across different tissues, a consistent limitation begins to appear, not in the ability of cells to rebuild, but in the conditions required for more complete reconstruction to take place. Because in order to restore a structure exactly, the body would need to recreate not only the cells themselves, but also the precise spatial organization, signaling patterns, and timing that originally shaped that tissue. And these processes are most active during early development, when the body is forming its structures for the first time, guided by coordinated signals that direct cells to grow, specialize, and arrange themselves in highly specific ways, and after this developmental stage is completed, many of those pathways become reduced or tightly restricted, and this shift is widely recognized in developmental biology, where the capacity for large-scale regeneration is often greater during earlier stages of life, and more limited in fully developed organisms. And in humans, this restriction is particularly strong, reflecting the need to maintain stability in a body that has already reached a complex and highly integrated form. And this helps explain why human repair does not typically return tissues to their original developmental state, because doing so would require reactivating processes that could disrupt existing organization, and instead the body relies on repair mechanisms that operate within the established structure, modifying what is already present rather than rebuilding from the beginning. And this approach is consistent with the need to preserve coordination across systems, especially in tissues that depend on precise alignment, such as those involved in movement and sensation. And this becomes more meaningful when considered in the context of human origins, because early humans depended on bodies that could remain stable and predictable over time, supporting repeated use and interaction with the environment. And in such conditions, a repair system that avoids large-scale reorganization would reduce the risk of functional disruption, even if it limits the ability to fully regenerate complex structures. And this limitation is not unique to humans, but is common among many organisms that have reached a certain level of complexity and specialization, where the cost of rebuilding entire structures outweighs the benefit when compared to maintaining and reinforcing what already exists. And this trade-off reflects a broader principle in biology, where systems that are designed for long-term function often restrict processes that could introduce instability, even if those processes might allow for more complete restoration under controlled conditions. And this is why human repair tends to stop at a point where the structure is functional and integrated, rather than continuing toward full reconstruction. And this stopping point is not a failure of the process, but a result of the constraints under which the process operates, including the need to regulate growth, preserve tissue identity, and ensure compatibility with surrounding structures. And as a result, the body produces outcomes that are consistent and reliable, even if they differ from the original design. And over time, these outcomes contribute to the overall experience of healing as something that restores function without fully reversing change. And this reinforces the idea that human repair is shaped not only by what the body can do, but by what it is allowed to do within the limits of its organization. And as this becomes clearer, the comparison with other animals begins to take on a more precise meaning, because it highlights that the difference is not simply one of ability, but of how developmental processes, structural complexity, and long-term stability interact to define what kind of repair is possible. And this leads directly to the next question. If the human body restricts access to developmental pathways in order to preserve stability, then how does it allocate its resources between repair and other essential functions? And how does that allocation influence the overall effectiveness of healing across different stages of life? When the body's limits on repair are considered alongside everything else it must sustain, another layer of constraint becomes visible. Because repair does not take place in isolation, it is part of a system that must constantly divide its resources across multiple essential functions. And in widely accepted physiology, this distribution of resources is a central principle, where energy, nutrients, and cellular activity are shared between processes such as maintaining vital organs, supporting the immune system, regulating internal balance, and sustaining brain function. And within this broader system, repair must compete for what is available rather than receive unlimited priority. And this competition shapes how repair unfolds, influencing both its speed and its completeness. And in humans, this balance is particularly important because the body is designed to support long-term, coordinated function, including a brain that requires a continuous and stable supply of energy. And this demand creates a constraint on how much can be allocated to rebuilding tissues, especially when there is no immediate threat to survival. And as a result, the body often directs its resources toward maintaining overall stability rather than investing in complete reconstruction of a specific area. And this does not mean that repair is neglected, but that it is calibrated within a larger system of priorities. And this calibration becomes more apparent when considering that repair is energetically costly, requiring the production of new cells, the synthesis of structural proteins, and the coordination of multiple signaling pathways, all of which depend on resources that are also needed elsewhere in the body. And when these demands are balanced, the body may favor solutions that restore sufficient function without requiring the highest possible investment. And this pattern aligns with widely accepted biological principles where organisms optimize the use of limited resources to maintain survival and function over time, rather than maximizing a single process at the expense of others. And this becomes more grounded when placed in the context of human origins, because early humans lived in environments where energy availability was not constant, and the body had to manage periods of physical effort, limited food, and varying conditions. And in such circumstances, allocating large amounts of energy to perfect repair would not always be advantageous, especially if it reduced the ability to sustain movement, cognition, or immune defense. And instead, a system that balances repair with other needs would support survival more effectively, allowing the body to remain functional even when resources are constrained. And this same pattern continues to shape human biology today, where repair processes are influenced by the body's current condition, energy availability, and overall demands. And this influence can be felt in the variability of recovery, where healing may proceed differently depending on factors such as rest, nutrition, and the presence of other stresses, reflecting the fact that repair is not a fixed process but one that responds to the body's internal state. And this responsiveness reinforces the idea that human repair is not designed to achieve complete restoration in every situation, but to operate within a flexible system that adjusts to changing conditions. And as this becomes clearer, the difference between what the body could theoretically rebuild and what it actually chooses to rebuild begins to stand out, because the limitation is not only in capability, but in allocation. And this leads to a more focused question about how these allocations are made. If repair must share resources with other essential functions, then how does the body determine when to invest more in rebuilding and when to conserve resources? And how does this decision shape the long-term pattern of healing and accumulation that defines the human experience of repair? As this distribution of resources is followed more closely, it becomes clear that the body does not treat all forms of repair equally, and that some processes are given priority over others depending on how directly they affect immediate survival. Because widely accepted physiology shows that systems responsible for maintaining vital functions, such as circulation, respiration, and neural activity, are continuously supported even when resources are limited, while other processes, including certain forms of tissue rebuilding, may proceed more slowly or remain incomplete when conditions are less favorable. And this prioritization is not random. It reflects the need to preserve the core systems that allow the body to continue functioning as a whole. And within this framework, repair becomes one of several competing demands rather than the dominant one, and this can be observed in how the body responds to stress, illness, or reduced energy availability, where resources are redirected toward maintaining stability and supporting the immune response, while processes that are not immediately critical, including aspects of tissue reconstruction, may be reduced or delayed. And this pattern aligns with widely accepted biological principles in which organisms allocate resources in ways that maximize survival under varying conditions, rather than optimizing any single function at all times. And this becomes more understandable when considered in the context of human origins, because early humans frequently encountered fluctuations in food availability, physical demands, and environmental stress, and under such conditions, a system that could adjust its priorities dynamically would provide a clear advantage, allowing the body to remain functional even when it could not fully invest in rebuilding every form of damage. And this adaptability is still present in the body today, influencing how repair unfolds in response to internal and external conditions. And it also helps explain why recovery is not always uniform, because the body's allocation of resources changes depending on its current state. And this means that even similar injuries may heal differently under different circumstances, reflecting the fact that repair is not an isolated mechanism, but part of a broader system that responds to the body's overall needs. And this system includes not only energy distribution, but also regulatory signals that influence how cells behave, directing them to prioritize certain processes over others. And these signals help coordinate the body's response, so that essential functions are preserved even when resources are constrained. And this coordination further reinforces the idea that repair is guided by a balance between what is desirable and what is necessary. Where complete restoration may be desirable, but maintaining stability is necessary, and this balance shapes the outcomes of healing in ways that are often subtle but consistent, because the body repeatedly chooses solutions that ensure continued function rather than perfect reconstruction. And over time, these choices contribute to the accumulation of small differences that define the human experience of repair. And this accumulation is not simply the result of limitation, but of prioritization, where the body directs its efforts toward what is most important for survival at each moment. And as this becomes clearer, the question of why human repair remains incomplete begins to shift toward a more specific inquiry. If the body consistently prioritizes immediate stability and essential function over complete restoration, then how does this prioritization change over the course of life? And what happens to repair when the balance between these demands begins to shift in ways that affect how the body maintains itself over time? As this pattern of prioritization continues across longer periods of life, it begins to shape not only how repair happens in a single moment, but how the body organizes its resources across time. Because the balance between maintenance, repair, and other essential functions is not fixed, it gradually shifts as the body moves through different stages. And this shifting balance is a widely accepted idea in biology, where organisms allocate resources differently depending on age, condition, and environmental demands. And in humans, this becomes especially visible because the body must support long-term function across many years, requiring a stable distribution of energy that can sustain vital systems while also managing ongoing wear. And in earlier stages of life, when growth and development are still active, repair processes can operate alongside these functions with relatively high efficiency, because the body is already in a state of building and reorganizing tissues, and the systems that support growth can also contribute to repair. But as development stabilizes and the body transitions into maintaining an established structure, the emphasis gradually shifts, and the processes that once supported rapid rebuilding become more tightly regulated, focusing on preserving existing tissues rather than expanding or recreating them. And this transition reflects a broader principle, where long-term stability becomes more important than rapid reconstruction, especially in a body that must remain coordinated across many systems over extended periods. And this coordination places limits on how much energy can be directed toward repair without disrupting other functions. And these limits become more apparent as the body continues to experience small forms of stress and damage, because each instance of repair must be integrated into a system that is already balancing multiple demands. And over time, this leads to a gradual change in how effectively the body can invest in rebuilding, not because the underlying mechanisms disappear, but because they operate within a different set of priorities. And this change is consistent with widely accepted understandings of aging, where maintenance processes remain active but may not fully compensate for the accumulation of damage. And this does not mean that repair stops, but that it becomes part of a system that is increasingly focused on preserving function rather than restoring original structure. And this shift can be understood more clearly when placed in the context of human origins, because early humans depended on maintaining functional capacity across long periods, adapting to changing environments without requiring complete restoration after every challenge. And in such conditions, a system that gradually adjusts its allocation of resources would support survival more reliably than one that attempts to maximize repair at all times. And this same logic continues to shape the body today, where repair is influenced by the need to maintain overall balance, even if that means accepting outcomes that are less complete. And as this pattern becomes more visible, the experience of healing changes, because recovery is no longer simply a matter of returning to a previous state, but of maintaining stability within a system that is continuously adjusting its priorities. And this adjustment is not uniform. It varies depending on the body's condition, the demands placed on it, and the resources available at any given time. And this variability reinforces the idea that human repair is not defined by a single limit, but by a dynamic balance that evolves across the lifespan. And this leads to a deeper question that connects the allocation of resources with the structure of the body itself. If repair is shaped by changing priorities over time, Then how does the environment in which the body exists influence this balance, and in what ways might modern conditions differ from those under which these systems were originally shaped? When the environment surrounding the body is taken into account, the pattern of repair begins to shift again, because the conditions in which the body operates play a direct role in how effectively it can maintain and rebuild its tissues. And this relationship between environment and repair is well established in physiology, where factors such as movement, mechanical load, temperature, and exposure to varying conditions influence how tissues respond and adapt over time. And in the case of humans, the body developed within environments that required regular movement, varied terrain, and continuous interaction with physical surroundings, and under those conditions, repair was closely linked to use, meaning that tissues were not only restored after damage but also reshaped by the demands placed on them. And this reshaping is a widely accepted concept in biology, where structures such as muscle, bone, and connective tissue respond to repeated stress by adjusting their organization and strength. And this process does not recreate the original structure exactly, but it supports function by aligning the tissue with current demands, and this alignment helps explain why repair in the human body often appears as a combination of healing and adaptation, where the outcome reflects both the need to restore stability and the influence of ongoing use. And this relationship becomes more grounded when considered in the context of human origins, because early humans lived in environments where the body was rarely still. Movement was necessary for obtaining food, navigating landscapes, and interacting with others, and this constant movement provided regular input that guided how tissues were maintained and repaired, reinforcing structures that were used frequently and allowing the body to remain functional across varying conditions. And in such an environment, repair did not occur in isolation. It was integrated into a continuous cycle of use, stress, and adjustment, and this integration supported a form of stability that was dynamic rather than fixed, allowing the body to remain responsive to its surroundings without requiring perfect restoration after each disruption. And this pattern is still present in the human body today, where the effectiveness of repair is influenced by how the body is used, and this can be observed in the way tissues respond differently under varying conditions of activity, where regular, appropriate movement supports maintenance and adaptation, while prolonged absence of movement can lead to reduced responsiveness in certain systems. And this does not suggest that movement alone determines repair, but that it is one of several factors that shape how the body allocates its resources and organizes its tissues. And this influence becomes more apparent when considering that the body expects certain patterns of use based on its evolutionary history, and when those patterns change, the balance between repair and maintenance may also change, leading to outcomes that feel less complete or less efficient. And this shift is not abrupt. It develops gradually as the body adjusts to its current environment, integrating both present conditions and past experience into how it responds to stress and damage. And as this becomes clearer, the idea that human repair is limited only by internal biological factors begins to expand, because the environment plays an active role in shaping how those factors are expressed. And this leads to a more focused question about how closely the body's current environment matches the conditions under which its repair systems were shaped, and what happens when there is a difference between those conditions and the way the body is used today. When the relationship between environment and repair is examined more closely, it becomes clear that the body does not simply react to damage in isolation, but responds within the context of how it is being used over time. And this interaction is widely recognized in human physiology, where patterns of activity and rest influence how tissues are maintained, strengthened, and rebuilt. And in environments where movement is regular and varied, the body receives continuous signals that guide how tissues are organized, helping to maintain alignment, flexibility, and strength in ways that support ongoing function. And these signals are not separate from repair. They are part of the same system that determines how the body responds to stress, because tissues adapt to the demands placed on them, and this adaptation shapes how repair is carried out, often reinforcing structures along the lines of repeated use rather than restoring them to a neutral or original state. And this becomes more understandable when placed in the context of human origins, because early human environments required consistent physical engagement, walking across uneven ground, adjusting to changes in terrain, and performing tasks that involved coordinated movement. And under these conditions, the body's repair processes were integrated with continuous activity, meaning that healing did not occur in a state of prolonged stillness, but within an ongoing pattern of use that influenced how tissues were rebuilt. And this integration allowed the body to remain functional even as it adapted to new stresses, creating a system where repair and movement were closely linked, and this link is still present today, but the conditions under which the body operates have changed in ways that can alter how these processes interact, because modern environments often involve longer periods of reduced movement, more uniform surfaces, and different patterns of physical demand, and these changes can influence how the body distributes its resources, sometimes reducing the signals that support adaptive repair. And when these signals are reduced or altered, the body may rely more heavily on basic maintenance processes rather than dynamic restructuring, leading to outcomes that feel less complete or less responsive. And this does not mean that the body is unable to repair under these conditions, but that the balance between repair and adaptation shifts, reflecting the current environment rather than the conditions under which the system originally developed. And this shift can be observed in the way tissues respond to repeated patterns of limited movement, where certain structures may become less adaptable over time, not because they are damaged in a dramatic sense, but because they are not receiving the varied input that supports flexible organization. And this highlights an important aspect of human repair, which is that it depends not only on internal biological processes, but also on the external conditions that shape how those processes are expressed. And this dependence reinforces the idea that repair is not a fixed outcome, but a dynamic process that reflects the interaction between the body and its environment. And as this becomes clearer, the question of why human repair feels incomplete begins to include not only the constraints within the body, but also the conditions outside it. Because the body's systems are designed to operate within certain patterns of use, and when those patterns change, the results of repair may also change. And this leads to a deeper question about how the body adapts when its environment no longer provides the same signals it once did, and how this adaptation influences the long-term balance between maintaining function and restoring structure. As these environmental influences continue over time, the body begins to adjust its internal expectations, and this adjustment affects not only how it responds to movement, but also how it carries out repair. Because the body does not operate based on a fixed standard of how tissues should behave, it responds to the patterns it experiences most often. And this responsiveness is a widely accepted feature of human physiology, where tissues adapt to repeated conditions, reorganizing their structure in ways that reflect the demands placed upon them. And when those demands become more limited or more uniform, the signals that guide adaptive repair also become narrower. And this can lead to repair processes that are more focused on maintaining basic stability rather than restoring flexibility or complexity. And this shift is subtle, but it becomes more noticeable over time as the body continues to adapt to its current environment. And this pattern can be understood more clearly when placed alongside the conditions under which the human body developed. Because early humans lived in settings that required constant variation in movement, posture, and physical engagement, and this variation provided a wide range of signals that helped guide how tissues were repaired and maintained, supporting a form of resilience that was flexible and responsive. And in contrast, when the range of movement becomes more restricted or repetitive, the body may begin to reinforce specific patterns at the expense of others. And this reinforcement is part of how repair integrates with adaptation, because the body is not simply restoring what was lost, it is reorganizing itself based on what it continues to experience. And this reorganization can influence how completely certain functions are recovered, because tissues that are not regularly engaged may not receive the same level of structural reinforcement, and as a result, the repaired area may remain stable but less adaptable. And this contributes to the broader experience of healing as something that restores function without fully returning to a previous state. And this experience reflects a deeper principle in biology, where the body prioritizes efficiency within its current conditions, rather than maintaining all possible forms of function at once. And this principle becomes more significant as time passes, because the longer the body operates within a particular environment, the more its internal structure reflects that environment. And this includes how repair processes are calibrated, which in turn affects how the body responds to new forms of stress or injury. And this calibration does not happen suddenly, It develops gradually through repeated interaction between the body and its surroundings, and this gradual change reinforces the idea that human repair is not defined solely by internal mechanisms, but by the relationship between those mechanisms and the environment in which they operate. And as this relationship becomes more apparent, the original question about why humans cannot repair themselves like other animals begins to include a new dimension, because it is not only about biological limits, but also about how the body's repair systems are shaped by patterns of use that may differ from those under which they evolved. And this leads to a more focused inquiry. If the body adapts its repair processes to match its environment, then how do these adapted patterns influence the accumulation of small changes over time? And why do these changes become more noticeable as the body continues to move forward rather than return to what it once was? As the body continues to repair itself within these shifting conditions, another pattern begins to emerge, one that is less visible but more persistent, because not all forms of damage are fully resolved, and some changes remain at a level that does not interrupt function but does not disappear either. And this idea is widely recognized in biology through the concept that small-scale alterations can accumulate over time, especially when repair processes prioritize stability over complete restoration, and these alterations can occur at different levels, including in the structure of tissues, in the organization of cells, and in the way systems respond to repeated use. And each individual change may be too small to notice, but together they create a gradual shift in how the body feels and functions, and this shift is not sudden or dramatic. It develops slowly as part of the body's normal interaction with its environment and its own internal processes, and this pattern becomes easier to understand when considered in the context of human origins, because early humans lived in environments where the body was constantly exposed to small forms of stress, such as uneven terrain, variable temperatures, and repeated physical effort, and in such conditions, the body did not need to eliminate every minor change. It needed to remain functional across many cycles of use, and this would allow small imperfections to persist as long as they did not interfere with survival. And this same principle continues to shape how the body operates today, where repair processes address damage to the extent necessary to maintain function, but do not always return tissues to an original, untouched state. And this leads to the accumulation of what can be described as micro-level changes, which are widely accepted as part of how biological systems age and adapt over time. And these changes are not inherently harmful, but they contribute to the overall condition of the body, influencing how it responds to future stress and how it experiences recovery, and this influence becomes more noticeable as similar patterns repeat, because each new repair builds upon a structure that already contains traces of previous adjustments. And this layered effect reinforces the idea that the body is not resetting after each event, but moving forward through a continuous process of modification. And this process is consistent with how long-lived organisms manage their internal systems, balancing the need to maintain function with the limitations of repair. And this balance does not aim to prevent all change, but to manage it in a way that allows the body to remain usable across time. And as a result, the accumulation of small, unresolved differences becomes part of the body's normal condition, shaping how it feels without necessarily producing clear or immediate signs. And this can be experienced in subtle ways, such as a gradual change in responsiveness, or a sense that certain movements no longer feel exactly the same. And these experiences reflect the underlying accumulation of micro-level alterations rather than a single identifiable cause. And this understanding shifts the focus from individual instances of damage to the broader pattern of how those instances are integrated over time. And it raises a more focused question about the long-term effects of this process. If the body continuously accumulates small changes that are not fully resolved, then how do these changes interact with each other? And at what point do they begin to influence the overall experience of repair in a way that becomes more clearly noticeable? As these small changes continue to accumulate, their interaction begins to shape the body in ways that are more noticeable, not because any single change becomes large, but because many small adjustments begin to overlap. And this overlapping effect is a widely accepted concept in biology, where systems are influenced not only by individual events but by the combined impact of repeated processes over time and in the human body. This means that each instance of repair, adaptation, and maintenance contributes to a network of subtle differences that influence how tissues behave. And these differences do not remain isolated, they interact with each other, affecting how forces are distributed, how movements are coordinated, and how structures respond to new forms of stress. And this interaction can create patterns that are more apparent than the individual changes themselves, because the body operates as an integrated system where each part influences the others, and when multiple small alterations are present, their combined effect can alter the overall behavior of the system, even if each alteration on its own would not be significant. And this becomes easier to understand when considered in the context of human origins, because early humans experienced continuous cycles of use and repair across many parts of the body, and in such conditions, the accumulation of small changes would not be unusual, but their impact would be managed within the body's overall capacity to function. And this capacity depends on how well the body can integrate these changes without losing coordination, and this integration is supported by the same regulatory systems that guide repair, ensuring that new structures remain compatible with existing ones. And this compatibility allows the body to continue operating even as its internal structure evolves. But it also means that the accumulation of changes is not neutral, because each new repair is built upon a foundation that has already been altered. And this layered foundation can influence how effectively future repairs are carried out, sometimes making them less complete or less efficient. And this does not indicate a failure of the repair process, but a consequence of how the body manages continuity over time, where each stage of repair reflects both current conditions and the history of previous adjustments, and this history becomes part of the body's present state, shaping how it responds to new demands. And over time, this can lead to a gradual shift in how the body feels, where movements that were once effortless may require more attention, or where recovery may feel less immediate. And these experiences are consistent with the idea that the body is integrating a growing number of small differences rather than eliminating them. And this integration supports long-term function, but it also introduces a form of cumulative complexity that influences how repair is perceived, because the body is no longer working with an unchanged structure, but with one that reflects its own history. And this perspective highlights that the effects of accumulation are not simply additive, they are interactive, creating outcomes that are shaped by how multiple changes influence each other within the system. And as this becomes clearer, the question of why human repair feels incomplete begins to take on a more precise form, because it is not only about the limits of individual repairs, but about how those repairs combine over time to create a body that is continuously adapting rather than returning to a fixed state. And this leads to a deeper inquiry into how the body manages this growing complexity, and what mechanisms allow it to remain functional even as the accumulation of small changes becomes more pronounced across the lifespan. As this accumulation becomes more complex, the body relies increasingly on its ability to maintain coordination across changing structures, because even as small differences build over time, the overall system must continue to function in a stable and predictable way. And this reliance on coordination is a widely accepted feature of human physiology, where multiple systems interact continuously to support movement, balance, and internal regulation. And these interactions allow the body to adjust to changes without losing its ability to operate. And this adjustment is not achieved by reversing previous alterations, but by integrating them into the current structure, ensuring that each part remains compatible with the others, and this compatibility is maintained through ongoing processes of feedback and adaptation, where the body constantly monitors how tissues respond to stress and adjusts their organization accordingly. And this continuous adjustment helps explain why the body can remain functional even as it accumulates small imperfections. Because the system is not static, it is actively reorganizing itself to accommodate those changes. And this dynamic stability becomes more understandable when considered in the context of human origins, because early humans depended on bodies that could adapt to varied and unpredictable environments, maintaining coordination across different types of movement and conditions. And in such settings, the ability to integrate change would have been more valuable than the ability to eliminate it, because eliminating every small alteration would require constant reconstruction, which is not compatible with sustained activity. And instead, the body developed a system that could absorb change and continue to function, adjusting its internal relationships to preserve overall performance. And this system remains active today, allowing the body to maintain a sense of continuity even as its structure evolves. and this continuity is experienced as the feeling that the body is still the same, even when it has undergone many small adjustments. And this feeling is supported by the body's capacity to coordinate its parts in a way that preserves function, even when individual components are no longer identical to their original state. And this coordination also influences how repair is perceived, because the success of repair is not measured only by how closely a structure matches its original form, but by how well it integrates into the existing system. And if the integration is successful, the repair is experienced as effective, even if it is not complete. And this perspective shifts the focus from perfection to compatibility, highlighting that the body's primary goal is to maintain a system that works as a whole, rather than to restore each part in isolation. And over time, this approach allows the body to remain functional despite the accumulation of changes. But it also means that those changes are carried forward, becoming part of the system that future repairs must integrate with. And this creates a cycle where each repair contributes to the conditions of the next, reinforcing the idea that healing is a continuous process rather than a series of independent events. And as this cycle continues, the experience of repair becomes shaped by both the present condition of the body and the history it carries. And this leads to a deeper question about how this ongoing integration influences the limits of repair. Because if the body is constantly adjusting to accommodate accumulated changes, then what determines how far this adjustment can go before it begins to affect function in more noticeable ways? And how does this threshold relate to the broader pattern of aging and long-term stability in the human body? When the limits of repair are viewed through the lens of long-term stability, another important aspect begins to appear, because not all forms of faster or more complete repair would necessarily benefit the human body. And in many cases, widely accepted biology shows that rapid or extensive cell growth carries its own risks, especially in complex organisms where precise control over cell behavior is essential. And this introduces a critical trade-off, where increasing the speed or completeness of repair can also increase the chance of error, and these errors may not be immediately visible, but they can disrupt the organization of tissues, alter how cells interact, or create structures that are less stable over time. And this is why the human body applies strong regulatory controls during repair, ensuring that cell division, differentiation, and tissue formation proceed within defined limits. And these controls are not simply constraints. They are protective mechanisms that maintain the integrity of the system as a whole. And this protection becomes especially important in tissues where precise structure is required for proper function, such as in coordinated movement or sensory processing, where even small disruptions in organization can have noticeable effects. And this helps explain why the body often favors slower, more controlled repair processes, because these processes reduce the likelihood of misalignment or instability, even if they do not fully restore the original structure. And this principle can be understood more clearly when placed in the context of human origins, because early humans depended on maintaining reliable function across many years, and in such conditions, a repair system that minimizes the risk of long-term disruption would support survival more effectively than one that prioritizes immediate completeness without regard for stability. And this perspective aligns with widely accepted evolutionary principles, where traits that enhance long-term viability are favored, even if they involve compromises in other areas. And in this case, the compromise is between the potential for more complete reconstruction and the need to maintain controlled, predictable outcomes. And this compromise is reflected in how the body regulates repair, limiting the extent of regrowth and guiding tissues towards stable configurations that integrate well with the existing structure. And this approach also helps prevent uncontrolled growth, which is widely recognized as a major risk in biological systems, because when cells divide without proper regulation, the resulting structures can interfere with normal function, and the body's repair mechanisms are therefore designed to avoid such outcomes by maintaining strict control over how and when cells are allowed to grow. And this control is one of the reasons why human repair often appears incomplete, because the system is actively preventing processes that could introduce instability, and as a result, the body accepts outcomes that are sufficient for function but not identical to the original form, and this acceptance reflects a deeper principle in human biology, where safety and stability are prioritized over precision, and this principle shapes how repair unfolds across the lifespan, influencing not only how individual injuries heal, but how the body manages accumulated change over time. And as this becomes clearer, the idea that faster or more complete repair would automatically be better begins to lose its certainty, because such repair would need to operate within the same constraints that protect the body from error. And this leads to a more focused question about the balance between repair and risk. If the human body limits the extent of reconstruction in order to maintain stability, then how does it determine what level of repair is safe? And how do these limits influence the long-term pattern of healing and adaptation that defines the human experience of repair? When the balance between repair and risk is examined more closely, it becomes clear that the body does not simply limit repair in a general sense, but adjusts how repair unfolds depending on the context. And this adjustment reflects widely accepted biological principles in which cells and tissues respond differently based on signals that indicate the condition of the body, the type of damage, and the surrounding environment, and these signals help determine how much growth is permitted, how quickly tissues are rebuilt, and how strongly the process is regulated. And in humans, this regulation tends to favor caution, especially in situations where uncontrolled growth could interfere with the organization of complex systems. And this cautious approach can be seen in how repair processes are slowed or restricted once a basic level of stability has been achieved, because continuing to rebuild beyond that point would require relaxing controls that are in place to maintain order, and these controls are essential for preventing disruptions in tissue structure, since even small deviations in how cells are arranged can affect how a tissue functions within the larger system. And this becomes more meaningful when considered in the context of human origins, because early humans depended on bodies that could perform reliably across a wide range of conditions, where maintaining coordination and stability would have been more important than achieving perfect restoration after each instance of damage. And in such conditions, a repair system that emphasizes controlled outcomes would reduce the likelihood of errors that could compromise function over time. And this pattern is still present in the body today, where repair processes are guided by signals that balance the need to rebuild with the need to preserve overall organization. And this balance is not fixed. It changes depending on factors such as the type of tissue involved, the extent of the damage, and the current state of the body. But the underlying principle remains consistent, where repair is allowed to proceed only as far as it can do so safely within the constraints of the system. And this helps explain why some forms of damage are repaired more completely than others, because the body evaluates the potential benefits and risks associated with further reconstruction. And in cases where additional rebuilding would introduce uncertainty or instability, the process may be limited, resulting in a structure that is functional but not identical to the original. And this outcome is not a sign of failure, but a reflection of how the body manages risk across complex systems. And this management is essential for maintaining long-term function, because the body must remain coordinated over extended periods, and any disruption to that coordination could have consequences that extend beyond the site of repair. And as a result, the body's approach to healing is shaped by a continuous assessment of how to preserve stability while addressing damage. And this assessment influences not only how repair is carried out in individual instances, but how the body evolves over time as it accumulates the results of these decisions. And this accumulation reinforces the idea that human repair is guided by a balance between what is possible and what is safe. And this balance shapes the overall pattern of healing in ways that may feel incomplete, but are consistent with the body's broader priorities. And as this becomes clearer, the question of why humans cannot repair themselves like other animals begins to include a more specific consideration, because it is not only about differences in capability, but about differences in how risk is managed within the repair process. And this leads to a deeper inquiry into how this management changes over time, and how it contributes to the gradual shift in repair that is experienced as the body continues to age and adapt. As this balance between repair and risk continues to operate over time, it begins to influence not only individual instances of healing, but the overall trajectory of how the body changes, because each decision to limit repair in order to preserve stability contributes to a broader pattern in which small imperfections are allowed to remain, and this pattern is widely consistent with current understanding in biology, where systems that prioritize controlled growth and structural integrity tend to accumulate minor variations rather than eliminate them entirely, and in the human body, these variations are integrated into the existing structure, becoming part of the baseline from which future repair proceeds. And this integration creates a feedback loop, where past outcomes influence present possibilities, shaping how the body responds to new forms of stress and damage. And this loop is not static. It evolves as the body continues to operate within its constraints, adjusting its internal balance between repair, maintenance, and risk. And this adjustment becomes more noticeable over longer periods, because the accumulation of many small, regulated repairs gradually alters the conditions under which new repairs take place. And this can lead to outcomes that feel less complete or less responsive, even though the underlying mechanisms remain active. And this pattern can be understood more clearly when placed in the context of human origins, because early humans relied on bodies that could remain functional despite repeated exposure to stress. And in such conditions, a system that integrates and manages imperfections would support survival more reliably than one that attempts to eliminate all variation at the cost of increased risk. And this perspective aligns with widely accepted evolutionary principles, where long-term stability and reliability are often favored over short-term optimization. And this is reflected in how the human body manages repair, consistently choosing solutions that maintain coherence across systems, rather than pursuing complete reconstruction in every instance. And this choice shapes the experience of healing in a subtle but persistent way, because the body is not designed to return to an unchanged state, but to move forward with a structure that reflects both its function and its history. And this forward movement introduces a cumulative effect, where each layer of repair contributes to the overall condition of the body. And as these layers build, the body becomes more dependent on maintaining coordination across a structure that is gradually changing. And this dependence reinforces the importance of controlled repair, because any disruption to this coordination could affect the system as a whole. And as a result, the body continues to regulate repair in ways that limit risk, even if that means accepting outcomes that are less complete. And this ongoing regulation shapes the long-term pattern of how the body ages and adapts, not as a process of failure, but as the result of many small decisions made to preserve stability within a complex system. And as this becomes clearer, the original question about why humans cannot repair themselves like other animals begins to shift again, because the difference is not only in how repair is performed, but in how the consequences of repair are managed over time. And this leads to a deeper inquiry into how these accumulated effects contribute to the broader process of aging, and how the body continues to function within a structure that has been shaped by its own history of controlled repair. When these patterns are followed across the full span of life, the connection between repair and aging becomes more defined. Because aging is not a separate process that replaces repair. It emerges from the way repair, maintenance, and regulation interact over time. And this view is widely accepted in biology, where aging is understood as a gradual outcome of accumulated changes that are not fully reversed, rather than a single event that suddenly alters the body. And in humans, these changes include the results of many cycles of repair that have prioritized stability over exact restoration. And each cycle leaves behind small differences that are integrated into the structure of tissues. And as these differences accumulate, they begin to influence how the body functions, not by stopping repair, but by shaping the conditions under which repair occurs. And this means that aging can be understood as a shift in the balance between what the body can restore and what it must carry forward. And this shift is gradual, because the mechanisms responsible for repair remain active throughout life, but their outcomes are influenced by the history of previous repairs and the constraints under which they operate. And this creates a situation where the body continues to maintain itself, but does so within a structure that is increasingly shaped by accumulated change. And this pattern is consistent with widely accepted theories in aging biology, where long-term function is maintained through continuous adjustment rather than complete renewal. And this adjustment allows the body to remain usable across many years, even as it moves further from its original condition. And this becomes more understandable when considered in the context of human origins, because early humans did not depend on maintaining a fixed physical state, but on the ability to continue functioning across varying conditions and repeated challenges. And in such environments, a system that supports continuity through gradual adaptation would be more advantageous than one that requires complete restoration after each disruption. And this perspective helps explain why aging does not appear as a failure of repair, but as a consequence of how repair is organized, where each instance of healing contributes to the long-term structure of the body, and this contribution is not uniform. It varies depending on the type of tissue, the conditions of repair, and the overall state of the body. But the general pattern remains consistent, where the body integrates past changes into its present form, and this integration influences how future repairs are carried out, often making them less complete or more constrained. And this is not because the body loses the ability to repair, but because the context in which repair takes place becomes more complex. And this complexity requires the body to continue prioritizing stability and coordination, even as it manages accumulated differences. And this ongoing prioritization reinforces the idea that aging is not a breakdown of the system, but an extension of its fundamental design, where repair is always balanced against the need to preserve overall function. And as this becomes clearer, the experience of aging can be understood as the visible result of a process that has been present from the beginning, where each act of repair contributes to a body that is continuously adapting rather than returning to a fixed state. And this leads to a deeper question about how this process continues into later stages of life. If aging reflects the accumulation of controlled repairs over time, then how does the body maintain function as this accumulation becomes more pronounced? And what mechanisms allow it to continue operating within an increasingly complex structure? As this accumulation becomes more pronounced, the body increasingly depends on its ability to maintain function within a structure that is no longer identical to its earlier form, and this dependence is supported by widely accepted principles in physiology, where systems adapt to ongoing change rather than resisting it. And in the context of aging, this means that the body does not attempt to restore a previous condition, but instead works to preserve coordination across tissues that have been gradually modified by past repair. And this preservation is achieved through continuous processes that adjust how different parts of the body interact, ensuring that movement, balance, and internal regulation remain stable even as individual components shift. And this approach allows the body to continue operating despite the presence of accumulated differences, because the system is organized to integrate change rather than eliminate it. And this integration becomes more important over time, as the number of small alterations increases and the body must manage a more complex internal structure. And this complexity does not prevent function, but it requires more careful coordination, because each part of the body must remain compatible with the others. And this compatibility is maintained through feedback systems that monitor performance and adjust responses accordingly, allowing the body to adapt its behavior to match its current condition. And this pattern is consistent with widely accepted views of aging, where function is preserved through adaptation even as the underlying structure evolves. And this preservation is not uniform across all systems, but it reflects a general tendency for the body to prioritize essential functions, such as maintaining movement and internal balance, while accepting gradual changes in how those functions are achieved. And this becomes more understandable when considered in the context of human origins, because early humans relied on bodies that could continue to function across long periods, adapting to repeated challenges without requiring complete restoration after each event. And in such conditions, the ability to integrate accumulated changes would support survival more effectively than the ability to maintain a fixed, unchanged structure. And this same principle continues to shape the body today, where repair processes operate within a system that is designed to manage change over time. And as a result, the experience of aging reflects not a loss of repair, but a transformation in how repair contributes to the overall condition of the body. And this transformation can be observed in the way recovery becomes more dependent on maintaining stability rather than recreating previous states, and in the way the body adjusts its responses to match its current structure. And these adjustments allow function to continue, but they also make it more apparent that the body is no longer returning to what it once was, and this realization shifts the understanding of repair from a process that reverses change to one that supports continuity within change. And this shift raises a deeper question about how far this continuity can extend, because if the body continues to integrate accumulated differences in order to maintain function, then what determines the limits of that integration, and how does the body respond when the complexity of accumulated change begins to approach the boundaries of what it can effectively manage? As this process continues into later stages, The limits of integration begin to approach a threshold where maintaining coordination becomes more demanding, because the body is now working within a structure that reflects many layers of past repair, and each layer has been shaped by the same constraints of stability, control, and resource allocation. And this accumulated complexity influences how effectively the body can continue to adjust, because the systems responsible for coordination must now manage a greater range of variation, and this management remains active, supported by widely accepted physiological mechanisms that regulate how tissues interact and respond to stress. But it also becomes more sensitive to disruption, because the margin for adjustment is narrower when the system is already operating near its limits. And this does not mean that repair stops or that the body suddenly fails, but that the balance between maintaining function and accommodating change becomes more difficult to sustain. And this difficulty is reflected in how recovery may feel slower, how differences may persist more clearly, and how the sense of returning to a previous state becomes less complete. And these experiences are consistent with widely accepted understandings of aging, where the body continues to repair and maintain itself, but does so within a structure that has been shaped by its own history of controlled repair. And this structure influences what is possible in each new instance of healing, because the body must integrate new changes into a system that is already complex. And this integration requires coordination across multiple levels, including cellular processes, tissue organization, and system-wide regulation. And each of these levels must remain aligned for the body to function effectively. And this alignment becomes more challenging as variability increases, because the systems that maintain coordination must work within tighter constraints, ensuring that adjustments do not disrupt the overall balance. And this challenge becomes more understandable when considered in the context of human origins, because early humans depended on bodies that could continue to function despite ongoing exposure to stress and change. And in such conditions, the ability to maintain function within a gradually shifting structure would support survival, even if it meant that perfect restoration was no longer possible. And this same principle continues to shape the body today, where the goal of repair is not to eliminate all accumulated differences, but to preserve a level of function that allows continued interaction with the environment. And this preservation is achieved through ongoing adaptation, where the body adjusts its responses to match its current condition. And this adjustment allows the body to remain functional, but it also highlights the limits of how much change can be integrated without affecting performance. And as this limit becomes more apparent, the experience of aging becomes less about the loss of repair and more about the boundaries of adaptation, where the body continues to operate, but within a range that reflects the accumulation of its past. And this perspective shifts the focus from what the body has lost to what it is still able to maintain, emphasizing that the system is designed to endure rather than to return to an earlier state. And this leads to a deeper question that carries into the final stage of understanding. If the human body is built to preserve function within the limits of accumulated change, then what does this reveal about the purpose of repair itself? And why does the body consistently choose continuity over complete restoration, even when that choice results in a form that is no longer identical to what it once was? When all of these patterns are brought together, the purpose of repair in the human body begins to appear in a different way, not as a process aimed at restoring perfection, but as one designed to preserve continuity across time. And this perspective is consistent with widely accepted principles in biology, where organisms are not structured to return to an original state after every disruption, but to maintain function across changing internal and external conditions. And in humans, this means that repair is shaped by the need to keep the system operating over long periods, even as its structure gradually evolves through repeated cycles of use, damage, and rebuilding. And this evolution is not random or uncontrolled. It follows from the accumulation of past repairs, the constraints of resource allocation, and the limits imposed by the need for stability and coordination across many interconnected systems. And when viewed in this way, the fact that the body does not fully restore itself becomes less surprising, because the goal of repair is not to recreate what was lost in exact detail, but to ensure that what remains can continue to function in a way that is reliable and sustainable. And this goal reflects the conditions under which the human body developed, because early humans lived in environments where survival depended on maintaining the ability to move, respond, and adapt across many cycles of stress and recovery, rather than achieving complete restoration after each event. And in such conditions, a system that supports continuity would provide a consistent advantage, allowing individuals to remain functional even as small imperfections accumulated over time. And this emphasis on continuity is still present in the body today, guiding how repair processes are regulated and how outcomes are shaped. And this guidance can be observed in the consistent pattern where healing leads to functional stability rather than exact reconstruction, where the body restores enough structure to support use, but does not attempt to recreate every detail that was present before. And this pattern does not indicate a deficiency or limitation in a simple sense, but reflects a specific biological design in which the body balances multiple priorities at once, including the need to repair damage, avoid introducing instability, preserve limited resources, and maintain coordination between systems that must continue to operate together over long periods. And this balance is maintained through regulatory mechanisms that limit how far repair can proceed, ensuring that new tissue integrates safely with existing structures rather than disrupting them. And these mechanisms operate continuously, shaping the outcomes of healing in ways that reflect the body's broader priorities rather than the expectation of perfect restoration. And this leads to a deeper understanding of why human repair feels incomplete, because it is not intended to produce a perfect replica of the original structure, but to produce a result that is compatible with the current condition of the body. And this compatibility is what allows the system to continue functioning despite accumulated changes. And as this understanding becomes clearer, the comparison with other animals also begins to shift, because it highlights that the difference is not simply one of ability, but of purpose, where each species balances repair, growth, and stability according to its own structure, lifespan, and environmental demands. And in the case of humans, the balance is set in a way that supports long-term endurance rather than rapid or complete reconstruction. And this perspective gradually changes how repair is understood, because it reveals that the body is not trying to return to what it once was, but to remain functional as it moves forward through time. And this forward movement carries the past within it, integrating each repair into the next stage of the body's condition. And as this integration continues, it becomes clear that healing is not a reset, but a continuation that preserves the ability to act, respond, and adapt, even as the structure that supports those abilities changes. And this realization opens the way to a quieter and more reflective question: if the body is designed to carry its past forward rather than erase it, then what does it truly mean to be fully repaired? And is complete restoration ever the goal, or is the deeper purpose of repair simply to allow the body to continue, even when it is no longer the same as before? When this idea of continuity is followed further, the meaning of repair begins to shift away from the expectation of returning to a fixed point and toward a quieter understanding of how the body sustains itself through change. Because the body does not preserve a perfect version of its past, it preserves the ability to function in the present. And this distinction becomes more apparent when the experience of healing is viewed over long periods, where each recovery does not erase what came before, but incorporates it into what comes next. And this incorporation is not a failure of repair, it is the way the system maintains coherence across time, allowing the body to remain usable even as its internal structure evolves. And this perspective aligns with widely accepted biological principles, where living systems are defined not by static perfection, but by their capacity to remain stable while undergoing continuous modification. And in humans, this capacity is expressed through the integration of past repair into present function, creating a body that reflects both its original development and the history of how it has adapted. And this history is not stored as a separate record. It is embedded in the organization of tissues, in the way structures respond to stress, and in the patterns of movement that feel natural or altered over time. And this embedded history shapes how the body experiences new challenges, because each new form of repair must take into account the condition that already exists. And this creates a continuous relationship between past and present, where the outcome of each repair influences the next. And this relationship becomes more understandable when considered in the context of human origins, because early humans depended on bodies that could remain functional across many cycles of use, adjusting to changing conditions without requiring complete restoration after each disruption. And in such conditions, A system that integrates experience into structure would support survival more effectively than one that attempts to return to an unchanged state. And this same principle continues to guide the body today, where repair is part of an ongoing process of adaptation that allows function to be preserved even as conditions shift. And this preservation does not eliminate change, but it manages it in a way that keeps the system coherent. And this coherence is what allows the body to feel continuous, even when it has undergone many adjustments. And as this becomes clearer, the question of why humans cannot repair themselves like other animals begins to resolve into a more precise understanding. Because it is not that the body lacks the ability to repair, but that it is organized around a different purpose, one that prioritizes the ability to continue over the ability to return. And this purpose shapes every aspect of how repair unfolds, from the regulation of growth to the allocation of resources and the integration of accumulated change, and it explains why healing often results in a structure that is functional but not identical to what was lost. Because the body is not attempting to recreate the past, it is maintaining a present that can support ongoing life. And this perspective gradually reframes the experience of healing, not as an incomplete process, but as a process that fulfills a different goal, one that is less visible but more consistent with how the body is designed to endure. And as this understanding settles, it leads to a final, open reflection that does not close the question but deepens it. Because if the human body is built to carry its past forward and remain functional within that continuity, then the idea of complete repair becomes less certain, and what remains is a quieter question about whether returning to what once was is ever truly possible, or whether the deeper nature of being human is to move forward with change, adapting, integrating, and continuing, even when the body is no longer the same as it was before. When this final perspective is allowed to settle, the human body no longer appears as a system that has simply failed to match the regenerative powers seen in some other forms of life, but as a system shaped around a different kind of wisdom, one that does not aim to erase every trace of damage, but to preserve the possibility of continued life within the limits of change. And this understanding is grounded in widely accepted biology, where survival does not require perfect restoration, only enough stability, enough coordination, and enough function for the organism to keep moving forward through time. And in humans, this has created a body that heals, but also remembers, not through conscious thought, but through tissue, structure, and accumulated adjustment. And this memory of past repair is not separate from life. It becomes part of life itself, shaping how the body feels, how it responds, and how it carries its own history into the present. And when this is viewed through the long background of human origins, the pattern feels less like a defect and more like a consequence of what it means to be a long-lived, highly coordinated organism. Because early humans did not survive by becoming new after every injury. They survived by remaining usable, by preserving enough strength, enough movement, enough integration to continue through demanding and uncertain conditions. And that same logic still lives in the body now, where repair is guided not by the dream of returning to an untouched beginning, but by the quieter goal of maintaining continuity across years of use, strain, and adaptation. And this helps explain why healing so often feels both real and incomplete at the same time, because something has been restored, but something has also been carried forward, and the body accepts that exchange as part of how it endures. And once this becomes clear, the original question begins to change shape, because asking why humans cannot repair themselves like other animals may sound at first like a question about missing ability, but it becomes, more deeply, a question about what kind of body a human being actually has, and what kind of life that body was built to sustain. And the answer is not that the body is weak, and not that it is poorly designed, but that it belongs to a form of life in which perfect restoration would not be the highest priority. Because the body must do more than rebuild a part. It must protect the whole, and protecting the whole means controlling growth, balancing resources, preserving coordination, and accepting that some repairs will lead to function rather than full return. And this acceptance, though quiet, may be one of the most defining features of the human condition, because it means that living is not a process of remaining unchanged, but a process of being altered without losing continuity. And that is why aging, healing, and adaptation are not separate stories, but parts of the same long movement, where the body continues to remake itself just enough to go on, without ever fully beginning again. And there is something deeply human in that pattern, because it suggests that endurance is not the same as perfection, and survival is not the same as restoration, and the body does not promise to make everything as it was. It only continues the patient work of carrying the organism forward, one repair at a time, within the boundaries of what is safe and possible. And perhaps that is where the educational value of this question quietly rests, because once the body is understood in this way, it becomes harder to judge it by impossible standards, and easier to see that its real achievement is not flawless recovery, but sustained continuity across a lifetime of change. And this does not close the question completely, because the body remains strange even when it is understood, and its limits remain part of its meaning, but it leaves behind a calmer and more useful thought that the human body may not be built to restore everything it loses, yet it is built to continue through loss, to adapt without fully returning, and to remain itself even while slowly becoming something else. And if that is true, then the deepest question may no longer be why humans cannot repair themselves like other animals, but whether being human has always meant living inside a body that survives not by becoming whole again, but by learning how to remain alive while carrying what it could never fully repair.